Hello everyone, this is Ryan Adams, and this is the first video in a series on how to build a test environment on your machine using VMs and Hyper-V, and it's designed toward building an availability group or failover cluster instance testing environment. Let's start off by just explaining what the environment's going to look like, what our end design and goal is, and then we'll dig into some of the specific features and configurations that we have. This is the architecture of what we're going to build out. What we'll see here is we've got two different data centers. Data center 1 is on a completely different physical network than data center 2. The idea here is that we have a 3-node cluster, and it's going to be a multi-subnet. This is a very common design practice because what this would do with an availability group is give me 2 nodes in this data center, and this provides high availability. And then if I want to add disaster recovery, I put node 3 over here in a different data center in a different physical location to take care of the disaster recovery requirements that my business has. So this is the architecture that we're going to build out. But in order to do this, there's a few best practice things that we're going to want to make sure that we have in place as we plan this out and think about it. One of the first things you're going to notice is this giant server sitting right here in the middle. This guy is my domain controller. He will also be holding routing and remote access services, and that is because we're going to use him as a router. This makes routing the internal traffic a little bit easier and allows all your nodes to get out to the internet. There is other ways to do this. As I talk through this, I'll explain why I have chosen to do it this way as opposed to the alternative of adding an extra NIC to every VM in order for it to be able to get out to the internet. So right now what I want us to focus on is we have 3 different networks at play here. Here's our first one. This is our public network. Now because node 3 is in a different data center, you'll notice that his subnet's different. He's sitting in a 172.16/12 network. All of these networks I'm using are non-internet routable ranges. Right, so this range here is a Class B range. I'm also using over here a public range. This is a Class A, very common 10 range that we see a lot. I'm using over here on node 1. My domain controller sitting in the middle is routing my public traffic from node 1 or node 2. They both have public traffic and both have public NIC cards, to the public network over here for node 3 sitting in this data center. All right, and we repeat this. We also have a private network sitting here. Again, I'm using totally different subnets here. I'm using a 192.168.5/24 network for the private for data center 1. On the data center 2 side, we're using 172.17/12. And the one for our availability group. Now, we can build failover cluster instances on here, but the goal is to build an availability group. That's exactly what this architecture is. But there's nothing stopping you from building a failover cluster instance on top of this as well. In fact, it is very common that I will build an availability group across all of these nodes, just like we see here, and then I'll come back and add a failover cluster instance just across these 2 nodes. I do that quite a bit just to have in my lab environment. That way I've got this stuff available for me to go play around with whenever I need to play around with it. So just keep in mind that we do have these 3 networks. This is, again, a very common best practice thing. Our public network is what's going to host our application traffic. All of our app is going to come in on that. Our users are going to talk on that. That's how we're going to get out to our routable public-facing side of our network. Then we have a private side. We will take care of setting this up in the cluster, but the private side is to handle the heartbeat between all 3 of these nodes. Right? And that's the only thing that's going to be on this network. It's just that heartbeat traffic. We want to separate this out because if you think of this in production, you think about it as a pipe in your house. You can only put so much volume of water down a pipe. It's the same way with a network. You start to saturate the network. You can only put so much volume over a single pipe. This allows us to separate the traffic. This gives us better throughput. So if I can have my public-facing side, my private-facing side, which will dedicate to Heartbeat, and then we're going to take the availability group traffic just for shipping those log blocks between the nodes in the AG and separate those out on its own NIC cards and network as well. If you had shared storage here and you were using iSCSI, then you would probably have an iSCSI network here as well. Again, the more separation of traffic, the better. The biggest, most important thing, though, is making sure this private network is absolutely on its own. If these heartbeats are sharing another network and it starts to get saturated to the point that those heartbeats stop talking and they don't make it across, this can cause several different things. It can cause unexplained and unplanned failovers, and even be as bad as creating node flapping, where we fail over from node 1 to node 3 and back to node 1 and back to node 3, and we end up flapping back and forth, and we don't want that behavior. This is one of the best things you can do, is making sure you've got this private network set up. So we'll have all this, and this is great because this will replicate what you would want to do in production from an architecture standpoint as well. So we're making our test environment as close to what we would want to do in production as possible to give us a good template to work from. That way when we do any testing, we're doing apples to apples here. So that's the architecture. That's what that looks like. To take a little bit closer at the IP addresses and the networks here, and this will be here on the blog post, so all of this will be documented, the architecture, all the IP address ranges and everything that I used. I'm not going to talk over this whole spreadsheet, but I'm at least going to give you a high-end overview. So we talked about there being a public network, and I'm using the 10.0.0 range. I'm using 10.0.0.40. 40 will always be the end IP address for anything that I'm using on my domain controller. 1 will always be the end for node 1. 2 will be the end for node 2. 3 would be the end for node 3. So this is the first network that's going to be public. Now, of course, it doesn't include node 3. You'll notice that node 3 is blank here because he's not on this subnet. He doesn't have access to it, right? He's in a different data center. He doesn't have access to this 10 network. He's on a different network. He's on this one. This is his match for public. He's running 172.16.0.3, node 3. So that way that this network, we will use routing and remote access services to make sure it can talk to this 10 network up here. Same with the private network. I'm using 192.168.5 as my network here. 5.1, 5.2 for node 1 and 2. That's going to need to talk to the private side of node 3, which is here. So we'll end up routing that network to this 172.17.0.3. And that'll take care of both my public and my private networks that we just talked about. But then, of course, there's also the availability groups. So in order to have that ship those log blocks on its own network and kind of increase our throughput, what we can do here is put it on its own network. Now, of course, I would have to have a valid network on both the data center 1 and the data center 2. So I'm using 10.0.1 as my network here for the first data center. The second data center here, I'm using the 172.18 network. The very last thing that you're going to see here is this. This is a NAT. This is what we're setting up inside of Hyper-V, inside the VM, that's going to allow this VM to get out to the internet using the NIC card on your laptop or desktop. But you'll notice that I've only put it on this column, right, which is my domain controller. Right? Now, what we're using the domain controller for with RRAS and all this kind of stuff, you would never do in production. Domain controller would be nothing but a domain controller and anything else. But this, of course, is just our test environment. So we're going to use him for multiple functions, one of which is going to be to get out to the internet. I could easily add another NIC card that's going to do natting to every single one of these other 3 nodes. I have chosen not to do that. The reason is because then I have an extra NIC card. When you go in and look at the network cards in the VM, that you would never have in production. Right? You would never see on any of your nodes in availability group an extra NIC card just to get out to the internet. So by having the other NIC card route through the domain controller, we avoid that extra NIC card on the others. Now what you'll also notice too is that also means that for the domain controller, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 NIC cards. So we are using a lot of NIC cards here on the domain controller. The others will just have 3, and that's the way it's supposed to look in production. So the domain controller is not how it would look in production. That's just for test and dev. So we can leave all of the oddities over there. That way the important pieces for our AG, node 1, 2, and 3, look exactly how I would expect them to look in a production environment where they would have 3 NIC cards: public, private, availability group. That's the scenario we're trying to build out here. So all these IPs, you don't have to memorize and know all these will all be out here. As we talk through this, the expectation now at this point is that you go create the VMs, install the OS, bring them up, add the amount of NIC cards, 7 to the domain controller, 3 to each one of the nodes, and configure them with these IP address ranges documented here in this blog post. Once you have that done, then we'll actually start walking through the configuration. So if you have not done that at this point, that's where you want you to pause the video, go build it out, and then come back and replay the video starting from this point here. That way we can start walking through the config. So now that we've got all that configured, here's what it looks like when I go into Hyper-V. Now I do have some extra VMs here. I have 2 of them. I've got one that I'm using here for Docker, and I've got one that I'm using, I've got a Linux VM running Ubuntu. But that's not what we're using here, right? The ones that we're actually focusing on here are going to be my 3 nodes, node 1, 2, and 3, and my domain controller. Now, in the blog post, I'll have these settings all defined and laid out for you. They're not going to match what I have here. On my laptop, it has 16 gig of RAM. That's where I would typically always have this set up and running. That way, if I ever need it to demo anything, I've got it ready to go. As you can see, the amount of memory I have here in this memory column is not going to work with 16 gig. This is on my desktop. I have a lot more memory here, so it'll make this run a lot faster to have this here. These numbers will not be the same. What I'm going to suggest is that you run 4 gig on node 1 and you only run 2 gig on the other 2 nodes. That will allow you to stay within your 16 gig on your laptop and still be able to run this. If you've got less than 16 gig, this is going to be really, really tough for you to pull off. I would suggest 16 gig is an absolute bare minimum just to be able to get these to start. When you think about it, if this was 2 gig and this guy was 4 and these were both 2, that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 gig, right? And you think, oh, I've got plenty left over. But your laptop is taking up some memory. And the big thing is that when VMs start, they actually take up a chunk of memory just to get started, and then they shrink back down. And so what will end up happening a lot of times, you'll start your domain controller, you'll start node 1, you'll start node 2. When you go to start node 3, it'll fail to run if you started it too fast. Wait until node 2 and the other nodes have all been up and running for a couple of minutes, and that memory ballooning has kind of come back down, and then start node 3, and he'll usually start okay. For me today, walking through this demo environment, I've got a little bit more memory to play with, so I've kind of bumped these numbers up to make life a little bit easier. But the numbers that you can minimally play with that I would suggest are documented here inside the blog post with this video. So let's take a look at a little bit of the configuration. The first thing I'll show you here in Hyper-V, and I'm running Windows 10 here on my desktop, so Hyper-V is included. It's free in Windows 10, so this is something that you can use. The first thing we're going to take a look at is our switch manager. We need to get our network pieces set up and running. And it's going to come with some already built in, like the default switch. But at the end of the day, we really only need 2. So we need 1, and for me, I called it wired. Typically on a laptop, I would have one called wired and one called wireless, depending on whether I'm plugged in or not. Here on my desktop, I just have wired. So I've named it. That's the name that I've given it, as wired, and it's mapped to the Realtek PCIe physical NIC card in my desktop. This is the guy that we're going to use for NATing and getting out to the internet. He will only be attached to the domain controller, nowhere else. Everything else that we're going to use here is actually going to be internal. Let me click on wired first, though, and let's just see what that configuration looks like. When we look at this, you'll notice that I've got external network selected here. This drop-down box has got all the physical NIC cards on my machine. I've chosen the one that I want to use as this Realtek PCIe. For the internal, and I've just named it internal, and call it whatever you want, I've just done the internal network. This will allow it to talk to the other VMs in Hyper-V, but it can't get out and talk to my host at all. That's great because we want this to be a self-contained test and development environment, so we don't need it to be able to get out. What you could do is, even though I created one called internal, you can actually use the default switch here. The default switch has defaulted to being an internal network selection. So if you want to, you could use the default switch here as well and only create one for like the equivalent of my wired that I have here in order to get out to the internet. So where this becomes important is how we talked about creating the NIC card settings. Let's open up the settings for this domain controller and just highlight the things that you need to focus on changing. The first one is going to be memory. All right, documented here in the blog post is the minimal amount of memory that you're going to use. 2 gig is going to be good for your domain controller. And then the amount of virtual processors. Now I happen to have 4 procs in my machine here, so I'm using 4 processors. This is up to you how much you do and don't want to do. I've got some demo environments where I keep it at 1. I've got some where I keep it at 2. It just depends on what I'm trying to demonstrate and show. For the most part, though, for us, in this machine, it's got 4. This choice is up to you, what you want to use and what you want to choose here. Then I've got my SCSI controller. When you create your VM, this is going to do this by default. It's just got the hard drive and the ability to attach a DVD drive. You'll notice that I've got Windows Server 2019 listed here. That's what I've actually got in here is an ISO for Windows Server 2019. So as we build this demo environment out, I will be using Windows Server 2019, and we're actually going to be using SQL Server 2017. We're not quite to GA as of the making of this video for SQL Server 2019, so we're actually just going to stick with the current GA as of now, which is going to be SQL Server 2017. Now check out these network adapters. There's a lot of them here. Let me click on the first one here so we can see what it is. As we zoom in, you'll notice that I do have 7 adapters. You're going to have to add the adapter. You can do that up at the top. I'll show you that here in just a second. Once you do this, you tell it what switch you want that network adapter attached to. The first one is attached to my wired switch. That allows my domain controller to access that physical NIC card that's attached to that virtual switch, which is that Realtek NIC card for me in this desktop, which allows me to get out to the internet. I have one attached to that. All of the others, you'll notice because this is the first one, right? He's wired. All of the others here are all set for internal. All other 6. All right, so taking a look at one of those, if I click on it, the only difference here is, actually let me just drop down box so you can see it, is that I've just selected internal here in the drop down box. Obviously the first one I selected wired. So these are all of the switches you created in your virtual switch. So you need to make sure you have that set first. And again, you just need the 2, one of which is going to be attached to a NIC card in your physical machine, the other which is just going to be using the internal network. If you need to add a NIC card, it's pretty easy to do. You actually go up here to the top, we'll click on Add Hardware, you click NIC Controller, and then you click the Add button. Once you click the Add button, he'll add a NIC card over here, down here to the bottom of your list, and then you'll have the NIC card that you actually need to configure and set. So that's how we've configured these, And again, these settings for the domain, for each of the nodes are all going to be documented here in the blog post. So you can look up how much memory is going to be used based on running this on a 16 gig of memory laptop and how many NIC cards they each need. You'll notice that I mentioned the other ones only need 3, and that is true, public, private, and of course one for our AG. Taking a look here, you'll notice that all 3 of them are on the internal network. None of them are routed or using a switch that would allow them to get out to the internet. They will be able to get out to the internet. We're going to use the domain controller as a router. We'll get into that later. So now we've got all of our VMs up and running. We've got the operating system installed. And that's it. We've got them configured here, their NIC cards, and all that kind of good stuff. The next thing you'll need to do is actually go in and put the IPs on these NICs. Now, I've already done that here. That's something you should have already done. If you haven't done that yet, pause the video, go back to the blog post, look up the IPs that we've selected for every one of these VMs, and go configure those on your NIC cards. Looking here at the domain controller, I've called him DC1. If we look at the NIC cards here, you'll see all 7 NIC cards. I have done one thing that may be slightly different, is I didn't just go in and configure the IP addresses. I named them. I named them very intentionally because I wanted to make sure, and I always suggest that you do this, that once we create the cluster, all of these networks show up inside of the cluster. It's really hard to tell what they are unless you label them. So I highly suggest that you label these. It's worth taking the time, especially in your public environment. It makes it super easy for me to know, hey, routed to host, I know exactly what that does. This is the NIC card that is on that switch that's routed through the host that allows me to get to the internet. Sure enough, I look in the connectivity space, internet access. It's the only one that has internet access. I can see that I have the public network 1, which would encompass node 1 and node 2. On the public side of node 3, I've also got the matching private, which would be node 1 and node 2, and the matching of node 3 here for its private, and then I've got the AG networks as well. We need to have all of these on the domain controller because he's the one that's going to do all the routing of these networks between each other. So you should have all of this done. Please name the networks. It's just the best thing that you can do. You'll thank yourself in the long run if you go ahead and name them now. So the first thing we need to do is we need to turn this guy into a domain controller. We've done nothing other than install the operating system and configure IP addresses. That's it. There's nothing else that's been done here in this OS. In order to do that, we'll start off doing add roles and features. We'll click next here, and we'll do role-based or feature-based installation is our choice. We're going to select the server from the pool, which is, of course, the server that we're on, which is DC1 here. It's the only one that we've got. So we'll go ahead and click next. Then we walk into roles. What we want to install as a role here is Active Directory Domain Services. So when I check the box, it automatically pulls up this dialog saying, hey, if you're going to install this, that's great, but we would suggest that you also install some of these other items. And these are the tools to manage Active Directory. So we'll leave this Include Management Tools box checked. We're going to click Add Features. And then we'll click Next. And that's all it adds here. Click Next, and then it comes into Features. Now it's checked some features off for us automatically. Here's the first one, Group Policy Management. And the next one is it's added these Active Directory tools down here. So the PowerShell module to be able to administer Active Directory through PowerShell. And we've got, the Active Directory Administrative Center, so things like Active Directory users' computers, domains and services, all that kind of stuff is all added here in the tools. So we want all those pieces here. So that's great. We'll go ahead and click Next. There is some information here that it's telling us, things to note. The biggest thing here is this second bullet point. It says ADDS requires DNS to be installed on the network. This is the one and only absolute hard requirement for installing Active Directory is DNS. Now, obviously, as we build out and go through building this lab environment out, we're going to be messing with a bunch of different technologies in order to get this all to work, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video, because so many folks, customers and folks in the community are asking me, hey, how did you create this? How did you get this lab environment going? And I wanted to be able to show that, because not everybody's familiar with all these different pieces of technology, especially those of us in the data world. We don't play around with some of this stuff, like Active Directory and networking and routing remote access services and all that, and DNS, all that kind of good stuff, kind of in the Windows type world. This is not designed to deep dive into all that stuff, right? I'll show you how to configure this. I'll talk about some things as we go through, but I'm not going to dig real deep into Active Directory and all that kind of stuff. But do you know DNS is a hard requirement here? I didn't check off DNS server. If I went back into the roles, there is an option for DNS that I could have selected there. This is going to automatically do that for me. That's not something I need to do right now. It'll just give me the warning that, hey, you're going to need to do this. So here it is. Here's all the choices and options that we've picked, so we can just click Install, and it's going to go ahead and add these features. Now for Active Directory, we install these features. All that does is put what we need on here to be able to install and configure Active Directory, right? So we're putting all the binaries and DLLs on here so we have the services available, but it's not going to create the Active Directory, right? We still have to run through the configuration. There's more work to be done here once it's actually completed this feature installation. So we're going to let that finish. Once it's done, we'll do that Active Directory configuration. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pause the video here while we wait for this feature installation to complete. Actually, you know what? It just finished. So no need to pause. But what we do want to take a look at here is it says, hey, additional steps are required to make this machine a domain controller. This is a hyperlink. It says promote this server to a domain controller. You'll also notice the yellow exclamation up here. Post-deployment configuration, it's the same thing. What this is going to do is this is going to run, for those in the Active Directory world, this is going to run DC promo. So we'll click this, and this is going to open up the DC promo. And what this tool will allow us to do is configure the Active Directory the way that we need it to. So for us here, the choice that we're going to do is add a new forest. These other two are add a domain controller to an existing domain or add a new domain in an existing forest. We're starting brand new, fresh for this development environment. There's no current existing domain or forest in operation right now. And this is what's the root domain name that you want to use. And I'm just going to stick with good old contoso.com. We'll type that in there and click Next. So that'll give us the root domain that we want to be able to call this. You can call this anything that you want to call it. Doesn't really matter. Contoso is just what I've chosen here for these demonstration purposes. Also notice that as we go through this dialog box and this wizard here, there's every page has got like more about domain controller options down here. So these hyperlinks will allow you to open up and configure some more information. So if you're questioning some things on here on the screen, you go, I'm not sure what this means. Should I select this or not? You can go ahead and click on this. It'll bring us some additional information for you to dig into that a little bit further. So there's a lot of cool new stuff being added to some of the wizards to be able to help you figure things out a little bit easier. Now it's gone on to the next page here, but if you see it's still thinking up here at the top, so we're still working on checking some of the things on the network. And some of the things that it's taking a look at right now is DNS. And you'll notice here that we've got the check boxes here. Everything's grayed out right now because it's still working on figuring out what is available and what's not. But I've got one here for DNS, and I've got one for global catalog, and I've got one for read-only domain controller. So it's going out, searching around, checking to see if those pieces are here. Now it's going to figure out during this wizard that I don't currently have DNS configured. Right? It's not installed. It's going to install the DNS role for me so that I don't have to go in and do that. If I had checked it off earlier when we walked through the roles, that would have been fine. But might as well just let the wizard go ahead and take care of it here. Now, I'm going to need the DNS server, and we're going to leave the global catalog. So the global catalog, when this is done, is actually going to stay checked. Because this is the very first domain controller, this is also going to be a global catalog. And so for those not familiar in the AD world, a global catalog is a special domain controller. He holds a subset of information of objects in the directory from everywhere in the entire forest. Domain controllers hold all the information for every object in a domain, and if it's a global catalog, then he has a certain subset of information of those objects from other domains within the forest. Now, we're not going to check off read-only domain controller. That wouldn't do us any good if it was read-only, because this is the first domain controller that we have, and we're not going to need that in this environment at all anyway. So we'll leave those checked. The forest functional level and domain functional level, I am installing Windows Server 2019, but Windows Server 2016 is the highest choice that we have here for the forest and domain functional level, so we will leave that selected at the highest level of Windows Server 2016. So it did finish thinking. I'm going to leave DNS checked here because we are going to need that as a hard requirement, and the global catalog, we can't uncheck that because it's the very first domain controller in the forest. And then we need to put a password in here. This is whatever password you want to use. I'll just put mine in here. Again, we're not building this for a production environment. If you were, if there was any password for you to not ever forget, this would be the one. This is the one that allows us to use the directory services restore mode if we needed to restore a domain controller. This is something we would absolutely need. So choose something here that you're going to remember. We'll go ahead and click next. We get a little bit of a warning here, and it says, hey, there's a delegation for this DNS server, because we're creating the DNS options now, that says, I couldn't find an authoritative parent zone. That's actually fine. It's just a warning. It's not an error. We're not going to delegate this off of another DNS zone. This is the first and only zone. So since this is the root, this is okay. You'll notice it didn't gray out the next box. We can click next. So there is no delegation here. We're just going to go ahead and click next. Now it's going to verify the NetBIOS name. Now we typed in contoso.com already for our domain name, so that's going to be our FQDN. So obviously our NetBIOS name based off of that is just going to be Contoso. So it's doing some searching here in the background to make sure that that's not already out there and being used or in use. As far as the NetBIOS name goes, it should automatically fill that into the box for us, just based on whatever you decided to use for your domain name. And that's really all there is there. Again, there's the more additional options choice down here at the bottom, so you do have that available to you as well if you want to do that and learn some more about this. So there it is. It's done. It's filled that Contoso in for us. So there's our NetBIOS name. We'll click next and move on into the next piece of the wizard. And this is going to be the paths section. And I'll describe this in a couple of different ways because it depends on how you are looking at this. If you're a DBA, you're going to look at this screen in a different fashion than what somebody that's an Active Directory person would. Your understanding of how it works is going to be coming from a different perspective, and it'll make more sense. What it's going to ask us for is, great, you're creating this Active Directory, which means that we're storing it in a database. Active Directory still uses the Jet Engine database on the back end, right? So Active Directory is based on the X500 standards from back in the day. It is an LDAP protocol is what we use for that. But in order to store all that, we need to store this in a database. Even though this is Jet Engine and not SQL Server, those general rules about separating data and log files come into play here. Now this is a lab environment on a VM. So I'm going to leave these as default, which means that my database folder, my log file, and my sysvol folder, I'm going to leave them all sitting here in C Windows. You would never in a million years do that in production. If you're a DBA, you know exactly why you wouldn't do that. If you're not, you might not know. Typically, we would want to take the database and the log and put them on different drives. That applies here even with the Jet Engine and Active Directory as well. That if we want additional throughput from an I/O perspective, if we can put them on different drives, we'll be able to gain the benefit of that separation of I/O. But here in domain or in a test demo environment, I don't really need to do that. So I'll leave those default where they are and see Windows. Now we're reviewing our options. So this is just showing us all the options that we've chosen in the wizard thus far, where we can kind of just verify everything. Here's what's cool. SQL Server folks that use SQL Server Management Studio probably fairly used to seeing this from the T-SQL realm, but check this out. There's this View Script button down here. This thing's pretty awesome. If we click this View Script button, it tells us that these settings can be exported to a Windows PowerShell script to automate additional installations. Well, that's beautiful, right? Because if you ever needed or lost your environment that you wanted to use for demos and you needed to recreate it, if you script this out, the next time you want to walk through this wizard and fill this all out, all you do is create your machines, kick the script off in PowerShell, and it does everything for you, everything that you selected here already. It's also just a great way to document your environment anyway. So I encourage you to click the View Script button and save it out. I'm not going to do that here. We'll go ahead and click Next. I definitely want to point that out because it's a super cool thing that's been added to be able to dump that out. And if for no other reason, just to document the configuration more than anything. So it's going to go through here and it's going to verify the prerequisites, making sure that all the things that we've selected are okay. I am going to pause the video here because it will take a few minutes for this to go through and check everything, and then we'll rejoin back just as soon as it is done. So hang tight and we will be right back. All right, we're back and the wizard has finished going through and checking all the prerequisites. It did come up with a couple of warnings here. Let's see what's going on. This first one says Windows Server 2019 domain controllers have a default security setting named Allow Cryptographic Algorithms compatible with Windows NT 4.0. This is just warning you that there are, if you have older client versions like Windows NT 4, that Windows Server 2019 is not going to talk to them. That's the short end of what this is. That's fine. That's not a problem for us here in this demo environment. It's no problem. The second one here says a computer has at least one physical network adapter that does not have static IP addresses assigned to its IP properties. Now, I've gone through and assigned IPs to all of these, but everything I did was in IPv4, not IPv6. So that's what it's seeing here, is that I don't have some static IP addresses set on the IPv6 side. I'm not using IPv6, so I'm not going to set any, and that's not going to prevent me or have any issues. That's perfectly fine, even if this was a production environment. What I will say is there are some internal communication mechanisms that the Windows clustering uses behind the scenes that use IPv6. So even if you're not using it, it still uses the transport protocol there. So do not disable IPv6. We've seen a lot of issues coming through our CSS folks related to that. So please leave IPv6 on. You don't have to configure it or do anything. Just don't uncheck the box in your network config for your NIC card. The last one we've already seen, the delegation for the DNS can't be created. Well, we know that, and that's not part of a problem because we're not delegating this. We're creating a brand new one. Otherwise, prerequisite checks were completed and they passed successfully. Click Install to begin. And it does tell me that the install, after it is done, will automatically reboot at the end. So I'll go ahead and click Install, and when it gets to the end, it is configuring all this stuff. It is going to force me to reboot it. Absolutely do that. We just configured a lot of different stuff here. So even if it didn't force it, I would want you to do that anyway. We're turning on DNS. We're configuring a lot of stuff, an Active Directory and domains, of course, and there's a lot of pieces that we just started getting rolling here. So let's make sure that at the end, you're going to go through and reboot this no matter what. But it should force you to do the reboot anyway. The one other thing I did neglect to say at the very beginning before we did this and created as a domain controller is making sure you name the computer. I called mine DC1. You'll see the computer name up here, right? So I'm in Server Manager. I've clicked on Local Server over here on the left. And I will see that right now, of course, it's in a work group. That's expected because I'm creating the domain. It'll be a domain controller soon enough. But I did name it DC1. So I'm naming the domain controller DC1, and I'm naming the nodes Node 1, Node 2, Node 3. So after I created the OS, I did rename them with that name. So make sure you do that ahead of time and get that name done. You can rename this after the fact, so it's not the end of the world if you didn't do that at this point. You can go back and rename it, but it's a little bit easier if you do it up front. So just want to point that out, that I did already name that, so it's got a friendly name instead of some of the ugly default names that they come with out of the box, right? So I'm going to go ahead and we'll stop the video here, and then we will come back for the next part of the configuration. Welcome back. The domain controller has now rebooted. Let's go through and verify a couple things just to make everything configured the way that I want it to be configured. If I click on local server over here at the left, sure enough, when we zoom in here, we'll find out, yep, it's part of a domain now. I've got the DC1 added to contoso.com. So that is my domain now. So he is a domain controller. The other easy way to take a look at that, and it's worth for verifying some stuff, is if I go under Tools, on this side now have a bunch of stuff available. Domains and trusts, Active Directory module for PowerShell, sites and services, users and computers, DNS. We've got a lot of additional things available under our tools to administer our new domain controller. Let's go take a look at two of those. First, let's take a look at users and computers. Currently, right now, I'm logged in as the administrator. When I first installed this OS, I gave the local administrator a password, and that's who I logged back into after this rebooted from being a domain controller. But I don't want to log in as the administrator all the time. I want an account that I'm going to use when I log into my other systems other than administrator. If you're going to use this for demo purposes, even though you could use administrator, it's best to make it look as close to best practice as possible. So I'm at least just going to use a user account. So when I open up Active Directory users and computers, I can see that I do indeed have my domain, contoso.com, sitting here. And I have all my default OUs as I would have expected that. So these folders are called OUs in Active Directory. It stands for Organizational Unit, again, based off of the X500 and LDAP standards. So I want to use the default users OU. You can create a new OU if you want to for this. I am going to create a new OU for service accounts. We'll do that in a minute. But let's do this. Let's right-click here. We're going to do New and User. And I'm going to create an account for myself. So we'll do Ryan. Last name is Adams. We'll call the logon name Ryan.Adams. That's who I'm going to log in as. Obviously, contoso.com is the only thing in my drop-down box name here. So I'm going to put all that in. We'll zoom in so you can kind of see how I've created that. So fill that out for the account that you want. I'm going to do Next. I'm going to give it a password. I'm going to confirm that password. And then we've got a few choices here. So user must change password next logon. This is me. I don't want to change it again. I just set it for what I wanted. So we'll uncheck this box. User cannot change password. No need for us to check that. I am going to do this. This is not something you would ever do in a production environment. But for my demo environment, I don't want to have to mess with changing my password. So I'm going to check password never expires. Again, not to be done in production. So we'll click Next, and then we'll click Finish. Now that creates the user account, but because I'm doing this as a demo environment, the one non-best practice thing that we're going to do here is we're going to go in and add my account to the member of a couple of different roles. It's in the domain users group right now. I'm actually going to add it to the domain admins group. Now be warned that this is nothing you would do in production, simply because I'm actually going to add it to enterprise admins as well. You would not do this in production at all. These accounts have absolute, complete, and total rights to everything. And when I say everything, I mean every computer, every user, every object that is joined to your domain has rights through these account groups. So again, this is just something I would do in my demo environment. It makes life a little bit easier. You may not want to do that. Maybe you want to be a little bit closer to what you're trying to demonstrate. You may be focusing on security, and so you just want a regular user account, and you don't want it to be added to these groups so that you can apply to the least use privilege right kind of ideal that we have going on, and that is perfectly fine to do. For me, I'll cheat a little bit. We'll add it to domain admins, make life a little bit easier. I am going to go ahead and create another OU. I'm going to right-click at the top here, and I'm going to go under New, and we're going to click Organizational Unit. and I'm going to call this service accounts. I'm doing this because I know that when I create and install SQL Server, that I'm going to need some service accounts. I'm going to need one for every node in my domain, node 1, node 2, and node 3. There's service accounts that I'm going to need if I create a failover cluster instance. So there's some accounts that I'm going to need. So I'm just going to create service accounts OU and kind of keep it all in that OU. So we'll click OK here. That gives me my service account view. I'm going to leave it blank for now. We'll come back and add the users later. But I just wanted to go ahead and create that while I was in here. So that kind of looks exactly how I would expect it in Active Directory users and computers. Let's just take a quick peek at DNS. Just want to see what DNS looks like now that it's kind of come up and make sure that that looks the way I want it to. If I look under my forward zones here, and I'll zoom in, this looks good. I'm seeing DC1 here as a DNS server. I am seeing the forward lookup zones that I would expect. Right, so I'm seeing my contoso.com zones here. So that looks good. I'm also seeing host A records over here. And right now, just looking at it, just glancing at it, this is pretty much what I would want to see. The only thing in here right now is DC1. And I definitely see a bunch of records in here for DC1, which seems kind of weird and messy. But if you think about it, that's actually how we designed it, right? How many of them are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, well, of course that makes sense. We have 7 NIC cards on this VM. So this is by design. That's why this is here. We can see all the IPs that I've assigned to these NIC cards. So those are all going to get registered every connection here in DNS. The only thing, this is totally optional, that you may want to do for yourself, and this is more of an advanced thing, so if you're just trying to build this environment, you totally don't have to do this. I'll do one of them here just so that you can see how this works. This is called a reverse lookup zone. I'm going to create a new one. A forward lookup zone is what translates a name into an IP address. Reverse does exactly the opposite of that. This will take an IP and turn it into a name. This is really great for troubleshooting. So I like to have these for troubleshooting purposes, and that's the only reason I do this. So I'm going to do primary zone. You'll do this for all of them. You will do this multiple times if you choose to do so. We are going to store the zone in Active Directory. That is fine. I'm going to do this. We have a couple choices here. We can do it to all domain controllers in the forest or all domain controllers in the domain. We'll leave it to the default, all domain controllers in the domain. We only have one forest with one domain anyway, so not a big deal. We're just using IPv4 here, so I'm going to do an IPv4 reverse lookup zone. And then what it asks for here is the network. So let me go ahead and throw this in here. And I'll zoom in so you can see it. It's asking for the network ID. Now do note that it says, even though you're creating a reverse zone, it's saying put it in its normal order, not reversed order. So this is the normal order. Now I have multiple networks. I'm just going to add one for now. This is actually my public network. Right, this is going to cover the public network side in Data Center 1, thinking back of our architecture, and that'll cover Node 1 and Node 2. Right, this was a /24 network, so it's a class A subnetted down to 24, so 10.0.0 is the network ID for that. So I'll put 10.0.0 in there, and then we'll click Next. We can choose to only allow secure dynamic updates. We can also allow both non-secure and secure. For this demo environment, secure only is perfectly fine. And then we click Finish, and it'll create our reverse zone in here. And then as things re-register, and they will have to re-register, so I'd have to reboot this to re-register, we'll see the reverse in here as well. So that'll allow me to troubleshoot because I can do a ping to do a forward lookup of a name to an IP. Then I can do an NS lookup, so I can look it up in reverse. It's very handy for troubleshooting. Again, not required, but just kind of a bonus thing here. I'm just kind of throwing in. Now let me go back to users and computers here and look at this default computers OU. Now my domain controller, of course, is in the domain controller OU, DC1, we see him here, but there's nothing in computers. So we know that the next thing we need to do is we got to join every one of our nodes to this domain. So what I'll do is I'm going to run through that one time on node 1. I will leave it as an exercise to you to add node 2 and node 3. And I'm just going to run you through this first one. Let me shrink this so there's no confusion here. This is node 1, right? Brand new OS. The NICs are already configured, right? We've already done all of that, so the NIC cards are here. If I click local server, I can see that he hasn't even been renamed. I didn't rename this guy yet. That's okay. I can actually rename him when I join him to the domain. I can do it all at the same time. This used to, back in the day, you used to have to do this separately, and both of them caused a reboot. Now you can actually do them both at the same time. So I'm going to click change here, and I'm going to change his name. So I'm going to call him node 1. And then I'm going to add him to the domain, which is contoso.com. And then if you click more here, there's some advanced DNS stuff here. For your purposes in creating this domain for this demo environment, you shouldn't need to change any of this. This should be perfectly fine. If you start getting into some more advanced configurations, like availability groups that are domain independent and that type of stuff, then some of these choices are things that you will need to change. But again, that is a more advanced configuration, another video for another day. But just so you know that it's there. So we'll click OK here. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to say, oh, great, well, you want to join us to domain. I need to make sure you actually have the rights to be able to join this to domain, that you're authorized to do that. So what username and password do you want to use? I just created my Ryan.Adams account. So we'll stick that in there with my password. Click OK. And then it's going to join the domain. Now, when it does this, just like creating the domain controller, is going to force you to do a reboot. So as soon as it's done, we're going to need a reboot. It's actually a little bit different. So the domain controller, you notice when you did that and you promoted it, it popped up and absolutely, you couldn't exit, you couldn't deny it. Like it's absolutely forced a reboot. There was no choice there. Here, even though it says, hey, look, you need a reboot for this to take effect, it doesn't actually force it, but it highly suggests it. Great, here's the pop-up box. Welcome to the contoso.com domain. We click OK. No warnings yet. This hasn't changed yet. Oh, look at that. Changing the primary domain DNS name. This computer failed. The name will remain contoso.com. The error was doesn't exist, could not be contacted. So that's just an erroneous error that we can ignore here because it says we haven't restarted yet. So restart your computer, apply these changes. So we'll click OK. Doesn't force you to do it. Tells you down here changes will take effect after you restart. Click close. Technically you could click restart later. We're not going to do that. We'll go ahead and restart it now. So you follow the exact same process for node 2 and node 3. There's no changes there, so that is an exercise that you'll do. And then once it comes back up, I'll be able to actually log in using my Ryan.Adams account as opposed to the local administrator account that I was using before. So it's back up. It's defaulted to other users, so I'll put in my Ryan.Adams account here and our password. Hit enter, and this is going to log us into the Contoso domain now that it has been joined. And we'll just click on local server underneath server management here, just to verify and see that it really and truly is added to the domain. Click local server. It no longer says work group. It now says domain, contoso.com, and my computer is node 1. So that's great. We're now perfectly joined to the domain. We can also verify that by looking at the domain controller, which we'll do here in just a sec. One thing I did want to show you is, of course, you're going to notice down here, and you've been seeing this whole time, that you've got no internet access down here. We will resolve that. Right, so right now it is true that it's got 3 NIC cards, node 1, 2, and 3. I'll have 3 NIC cards, all wired to the internal network. They can't get out yet. We haven't installed a router. That's what we need to do next. So we'll go back to the domain controller, and we'll take a look at that. So let's put node 1 away for a minute. Come back in here to node 3. I'm sorry, our domain controller. And if I was still in the computers OU. If I click refresh, sure enough, there's node 1. So he successfully joined. And then once we do node 2 and node 3, they'll pop right in here into the default computers OU. So we know that piece is good. So the domain's here, but what we don't have is the internet piece done. And it's not just the internet piece that we're missing, right? When we look back at our domain architecture again here, and we look at the network, we have to be able to route public to public, private to private, and AG to AG. in order for node 3, who's in a different data center, to talk to the first two nodes that are in this first data center. So we need to handle all this routing piece. So how we're going to do that is we're going to use routing and remote access services. And we'll do that here on the domain controller. So I'll just go back into Server Manager. Just like everything else, the first thing we need to do, I'll go back to the dashboard, is add a role and a feature. This is a role. So we'll click Next here. We're going to do role-based, of course. Select DC1 here. That's the server I want. And then I'm going to come down here and check off Remote Access. This is the one that we want to choose right here. So I'll put a checkbox there in the box, and we'll click Next. There's no additional features that we're adding at this particular point in time right now. So we'll go blow through that, and we get some information here about routing and remote access services. So we'll do Next there. And it says, hey, there's a few different components here that you may want to install. The only one we really care about here is actually routing. That's the only one that we really need. So when we check that off, it says, oh, hey, there's a couple more tools, just like it did before. You may want to have these tools installed, which is true. We absolutely want these installed in order to be able to manage that. So we'll click Add Features. That's perfectly fine. It's going to add direct access and VPN. That kind of comes as part of the suite there. We don't need the web application proxy, so we're not concerned about that. So in order to do this, it's got a web server role in IIS that it's got to be able to do to install in order to manage that. So it's got some web server components that are being used here as part of that. We're just going to stick with the default here. There's no need to change any of this for our purposes for this particular environment. So it says, hey, confirm all this stuff's going to be installed, and install. We'll click go. So we're going to let that go through the installation. I want to pause the video again here. That way we can let that install go through. When we come back, we'll jump through how to configure routing and remote access services in order to get all that routing and network piece going. We can make sure our nodes can talk to each other, they can get to the internet, and all that kind of good stuff. That way we can make sure everybody's talking and all good before we start digging into the clustering part. And then that's where we'll go in our stage 2 of this series. Part 2 is going to start getting into the actual Windows piece. So we'll pause right here, let that, and then we'll join back up together as soon as that's done. All right, we are back, and the feature installation and role installation for our routing and remote access services is now complete. It does tell us that there is some configuration required, just like Active Directory did. All right, so we've installed the services, but we haven't actually configured or done anything. You can do this open the Getting Started wizard. We're actually not going to do that. So we're going to click Close here. And the reason we're not going to do that is because there are other features that the wizard wants you to install during the routing and remote access configuration that we really don't need. So what we're going to do is we'll go into Server Manager. We're going to go under Tools, and we're going to specifically select Routing and Remote Access right here. When we open this guy up, we'll notice that we've got the red down arrow here. It's not configured or anything. It's not turned on. So what we're going to do here is we'll right-click our server, our domain controller, and we're going to do Configure and Enable Routing and Remote Access. And this brings up the wizard. We'll skip the welcome screen here, and it gives us some choices and options. We are actually going to select Custom Configuration. The reason being is because we actually need 2 of these things. We don't need dial-up or VPN. That's out. We do need NAT. That's what's going to allow us, and you'll see it says allow internal clients like node 1, 2, and 3 to connect to the internet using one public IP address. Which, remember, we have one public IP address here on this domain controller. He's the one that is routed to the wired switch on the host through Hyper-V. That's what everybody's going to use to get out to the internet. So we need that. We don't need, this does VPN and NAT combined. Obviously, we didn't need the VPN, so there's no need there. And then there's this one, secure connection between 2 private networks. We do need that. We have some private networks here, right? We have 3 of them, actually, that we need to get to be able to talk to each other. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to select this custom config down at the bottom. That way we can select NAT. and the connection between the private networks. So that'll allow us to kind of pick and choose which ones we want. Let me go ahead and pick them, right? These are the two we want here. We're going to go ahead and select NAT and LAN routing. So we'll do next here. We'll click Finish, and then it'll say it's ready to use. We're going to click the Start Service button right here in order to start our RAS service. So that'll get the service started here on DC1. We'll see the red up here change to green once it gets the service started. And it does some configuration for us already. So we're focused on IPv4. If we click General here, and again, just like DNS and Active Directory, that's digging in deep to all of these things. It is not something we're getting through in these videos, right? I'm just showing you how to create in the easiest, shortest fashion possible an environment that you can use to demo availability groups and also FCIs if you so choose. This has actually already figured everything out. It has figured out, hey, because I remember I told you to label them. There's another reason why. Net 1, private and public. Net 2, private and public. Here's the AG networks. It's already done them all. So they can already talk to each other. In fact, the one thing before we did a break is I told you that after you added node 1, you needed to join node 2 and node 3 to the domain. What I forgot about was that although that works fine for node 2, you can't add node 3 until you've done this RAS config because they're completely different networks. They're all in that 172 class B range. They can't talk to the domain controller because we don't have routing turned on. As of right now, it's turned on. We can route that. But that just means that the domain controller, node 1, 2, and 3 can all talk to each other internally. That doesn't allow me to get out to the internet. So far I haven't had to really do anything. This is the only thing I really need to do is come down here to NAT. We'll click on NAT. We're going to right click and we're going to select New Interface. So I'll click New Interface, and it says this routing protocol runs on the interface that you select below. Once again, proving the point why we want to name all of our NIC cards. Guess what? Routed to host, that's our guy. He's the one that we can get out to the internet using the host NIC card through Hyper-V. So we'll select him, routed to host. We're going to click OK. And then here we're going to choose that this is a public interface connected to the internet, and we're going to choose to enable NAT on this interface. These other tabs, address pool and services and ports, there's nothing you need to do here. We just need to say this is a public interface, enable NAT on the interface, and tell it OK. As soon as we do that, we can now get out to the internet. If I come over here to node 1, the first thing you'll notice is that yellow exclamation point that was down here, it's gone. And if I hover over it, now it says internet access. We didn't have that going on before. And if I open up IE, there we are, bing.com. So now we're able to route that out. So now everybody can talk. And I can join node 3 to the domain now that he's able to talk. And I actually already did that while we were at break there, waiting for the RAS to install. In fact, going back over here and looking at Active Directory users and computers, if I refresh, you'll see that I did join my other 2 nodes to the domain here. So all my routing is now configured. So my network piece is taken care of. Everything in my NIC cards is labeled correctly. I have a domain controller. I have DNS. RAS is installed. Everything's being routed, both NATing out to the internet and being able to get to each other within the nodes. And again, the whole reason I do this RAS thing in this demo environment is simply because I could have added a 4th NIC to this. In fact, if I go in and we'll take a look here at the NIC options and look at the adapters here, you'll notice the details here. And again, I labeled them, right? Network 1 private, network 1 public, right? This is all in the blog post. Label these according to what's in the spreadsheet that I've got there inside of that table matrix, and get those named properly and correctly. And then you'll notice taking a look at these NIC cards in here that we've kind of got everything laid out the way that we want it to be laid out. We know exactly what it is and what it's supposed to do. and all of those good pieces. So if you wanted to go in and take a look at public, we could take a look at that. Looking at TCP/IP4, you can see that here's what I've labeled and called everything. Using the 10 network is what I'm using, telling it that my DNS server is 10.0.0.40, which is the domain controller, in order to allow me to get out to the internet and be able to access all that stuff. So now that all of these pieces are done, and I've got everything labeled correctly and everything routed correctly, we're done with part one. We've got all the pieces and the infrastructure taken care of and built up and ready to go. And I don't have that extra force NIC card sitting in here to get out to the internet, because I wouldn't in production. In production, in a real environment, I would have a private, a public, and an AG, and that's it. That's why we did the RRAS. Now that those pieces are together, that concludes part one. In part two, we'll start talking about how we build the cluster. How do we take care of the Windows piece of actually building out the cluster and making sure that it is created correctly and the way that we want that to be corrected in the different pieces there. So that's the end of this video for now. Then I will join back in part two, and we'll start taking a look at the Windows piece, and then part three we'll take a look at the SQL piece. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.